Ken, thank you so much for joining us today. It's
My
really nice
pleasure.
to see
Thanks for
you.
your interest.
So you're publishing a book this month, which looks back on your 3 decades leading one of the biggest human rights organizations in the world. That's Human Rights Watch. Why did you write this book?
Well, the main reason is that when I speak to people about the work of Human Rights Watch, there's this tendency to think, oh, isn't that nice? Very well intentioned. So glad for you. But this stuff doesn't work, does it? And indeed, there is a whole cottage industry of academic critics out there who love to second guess and say, oh, you can't get anything done this way. And so I just wanted to take on the skeptics. And I thought the best way to do that was to pull back the curtain and give kind of an insider's view of how we get things done. Talk about, what were the strategies? How did we settle on those strategies? And then just illustrate how it works. And obviously it doesn't always work, and I'm quite honest in the book that, you can't treat the defense of human rights as a bunch of simple wins. It's just not like that. But there are times when we do get big wins. And there are other times when you can tell that the target is feeling the heat, that they're moderating the behavior. And I just thought it was worth setting that out. The best way to do it was not, didactically, not with generalizations, but just with stories. And so that's what I tried to do through the book.
When you took over Human Rights Watch, it's the 90s, the end of history, quote unquote, and kind of the human rights sector has sort of grown up in quite a stable-ish international order. There was international law, there were norms. Jimmy Carter, as president, had, as you write in the book, kind of put human rights at the center of like foreign policy. Now we've got Donald Trump in the White House sanctioning the ICC, seeking closer relations with Putin's Russia, which is of course responsible for, brutal actions in Ukraine. So what does the picture look like for the upholding of human rights now compared to when you started your career?
Well, Trump today is clearly a challenge, but I think we need to put that in perspective because it was never as if, the past were these halcyon days where everything worked. When Jimmy Carter introduced the concept of human rights as an element of U.S. foreign policy, it was the middle of the Cold War, and U.S. foreign policy was filled with double standards. In fact, Carter was repudiated by Reagan, who, his UN ambassador, Jeane Kirkpatrick, introduced this academic distinction between totalitarian regimes, meaning communist regimes that were U.S. enemies, whose human rights record should be bashed, and mere authoritarian regimes, meaning the right-wing friendly dictatorships in Latin America, who could be coaxed to evolve gradually. So it was a nice big academic distinction for a blatant double standard. That was the Cold War. When the Cold War ended, things looked better for a while. It looked like the democracies had prevailed. And then we got the breakdown of countries like Yugoslavia with horrible ethnic cleansing. And so there was a whole period where, suddenly it looked like the order of the Cold War was being dismantled with huge violent consequences. That gradually improved. But then we got, Bush's war on terrorism after September 11th, 2001. Which again introduced a huge double standard. The U.S. government blatantly torturing people, rounding people up and sticking them in Guantanamo. We got past that. There was a period in the next decade, let's say, where gradually things improved. But then remember, this is the second time we've had Trump. He came in and sanctioned the ICC already in his first term. He cozied up to autocrats in his first term. At that point, the world did come together. And what I worry about today a bit is that while, frankly, we were able to compensate for the lack of the U.S. as an advocate of human rights during Trump's first term, can we do that again? And, we don't have Angela Merkel as German chancellor. We don't have Emmanuel Macron in anywhere near as powerful a position as he was during Trump's first term. The British government, we have Keir Starmer, who seems to be sympathetic, but has his own domestic challenges. And so as I look to Europe, it's not clear to me where that leadership is. There are democracies around the world which have come forward. South Africa with respect to Israel, a number of the Latin American democracies with respect to Venezuela. There are, other forces for human rights out there. But I think the challenge now is to build coalitions and really, substitute for the lack of a U.S. voice, as we've had to do in the past, in various circumstances, whether it's, dealing with Trump's first term or, creating the International Criminal Court, creating the landmines treaty, creating the treaty against cluster munitions, all done with U.S. opposition, not just a lack of support. So it can be done, but it takes work.
We'll go back soon to the challenges of upholding human rights in a world in the very strange times we're living through. But I wanted to go back to the book a second. You open it with a chapter on Syria as a case study, and we wondered why Syria is the opening to your book.
Well, I should say it wasn't because I could anticipate Assad's fall. That was just fortuitous.
Right.
But I chose Idlib, the portion of Syria that I focused on, the northwestern part of the country, which was the only part controlled by the armed opposition, because I wanted to show that even in an impossible case, even in a situation where you had the Assad government, which seemed immune to having its reputation tarnished because it had no reputation, even there, we could get things done. And so I spent some time describing how gradually we enlisted the German government, the French government, and the Turkish governments foremost, with the strategy not of pressuring Assad, which was hopeless, but of pressuring Putin, because Assad needed Russia's support to stay in power. And Putin at that stage, we forget now after Ukraine, when Putin also was kind of losing his reputation. At that stage, Putin cared about his reputation. And we knew that with pressure from these three governments that he cared about, we could get him to stop, in that case, deliberately bombing hospitals and schools and marketplaces and apartment buildings in Idlib, which he had been doing over and over and over again. And it took a few years. It was a very concentrated, intense effort requiring documentation of what was happening, but also visiting. I mean, I personally met with Merkel and Macron. I went multiple times to Ankara, the Turkish capital. And it gradually paid off because their pressure on Putin got him to agree to stop the bombing. And it stopped. And so for a good 3 years, the people of Idlib, millions of people, half of whom had taken refuge there from elsewhere in Syria, didn't have to worry about being killed suddenly by a bomb dropping on their heads. And so I chose this just because there was a real impact, but it was also an impossible situation, and still we got something done.
Mm. This question of reputation is really interesting. And as a reader of this book, one of the things that I found fascinating is the importance of these almost personal relationships between key figures, between leaders like Merkel, who you've mentioned, and Macron, who can maybe put pressure on other governments and other leaders who are responsible for human rights violations. And related to that, you write about kind of the role that shame, the importance that shame has in the human rights sector, and how important that is in, when you scrutinize a political leader's behavior, that they somehow feel shame around that and so would moderate their behavior. And I think that's really fascinating. Can you talk to us a bit about what happens when that doesn't work? As you say, Putin has changed perhaps since those days. So what does Human Rights Watch and similar organizations, what do they do when shame doesn't function?
Well, first, maybe I can explain for a moment what I mean by shame, because I don't mean that a tyrant feels guilty. They could have zero remorse. We're not into this for, reasons of kind of personal betterment. But rather, every government in today's world has to pretend to respect human rights. That's a basic aspect of their legitimacy. And what that really means is that they are pretending to serve their people and not just themselves. And so if we can show that they're not doing that they're violating these basic international norms, we delegitimize them. And that matters in terms of their ability to sustain domestic support. It also matters in terms of their ability to sustain international relations, which come with, say, trade benefits or military aid or arms sales, or sometimes something as simple as getting to be photographed at a summit so you can tell the folks back home, look, I'm a legitimate leader, because all these other legitimate leaders, clinked champagne with me. So these are the kinds of things that we try to affect. Essentially a government's ability to hang on to power by virtue of portraying itself as legitimate. So that's what shaming is about. And every government hates having its reputation tarnished. And so, I mean, one example that I give is China, which you would think is, so beyond this, and it's not. I describe in the book a campaign that we mounted to try to put the situation of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang on the agenda of the UN Human Rights Council. And we actually failed by 2 votes. It was a very close effort. But it mattered so much to China. China was so desperate to avoid the stigmatization that would have come with UN Human Rights Council scrutiny that Xi Jinping himself was picking up the phone and calling other leaders, pushing them to vote with China. You don't do that if you don't care. And so it illustrates, even in a situation which is very much an ongoing battle, trying to improve the fate of the Uyghurs, it shows that this process of shaming works with even the most powerful governments. So that's the theory. Now, what happens when, a government no longer has much of a reputation? And I mean, one of the reasons I focused on Syria was that even there, where, Assad was obviously executing tens of thousands of people, he was dropping barrel bombs on opposition-held cities. He was, dropping chemical weapons on civilians in those cities. He still tried to deny a lot of these atrocities. To openly admit them would have been too shameful, too delegitimizing. And so we were actually able to get the chemical weapons to stop by demonstrating that he was using them, which was not the simplest thing because he would blame the rebels. And so you had to show, okay, yes, there was a sarin attack or yes, there was a chlorine attack, but we had to show who did it. And that took work. It took real careful investigation. But as we were able to demonstrate that, Russia wouldn't defend him. The international community was stepping in. And gradually, under pressure, he stopped. And similar things happened, for example, with his effort to starve the people of northwestern Syria by denying them international humanitarian assistance. And he was going to do this by insisting that all aid go through Damascus, where he just wouldn't let it get to the northwest, rather than going cross-border from Turkey, where it went directly there. And that, again, took a huge effort, again, focusing on Putin. I describe in the book what we called the Sochi strategy, which was to basically force Putin to vote on a UN Security Council resolution as the Sochi Olympics were taking place. And he didn't want to mess up his party. And so, the Sochi strategy worked. And he allowed this to go forward, where otherwise he wouldn't have. Otherwise, he would have supported Assad's starvation strategy. So, there's kind of always an angle. I mean, that's one of the things that I try to show in the book. You've got to be creative. You got to think through, what does the target care about and how can we prevent them from getting it until they change their behavior?
One of the really complicated and interesting case studies in your book, of course, is Israel. We've had now 16 months of war in Gaza following that attack on the 7th of October. And Israel, I think, at this point has, reached a kind of pariah status that it hasn't had in decades. And of course, Human Rights Watch over many years has faced criticism over its coverage of Israel from Israel advocates. I think Human Rights Watch, aside from just general reporting on the violations, the fact that you guys, or not you, formerly you guys, found that Israel was guilty of committing crimes of apartheid in the occupied territories, for example, and you got a lot of criticism personally, on that. You write in the book that you've been called the most powerful and obsessive Israel basher of the 21st century. How do you respond to those accusations? You've had them kind of over many, many years from people advocating for Israel. What do you say to them?
Well, I mean, let me respond, Alona, in 2 ways. I mean, first of all, I learned early on that whenever you criticize Israel, you can anticipate being bashed. And so, one solution to that would be to stop criticizing Israel. That's what they want. I wasn't going to do that. And so the alternative is to be super careful and to make sure that everything we said about Israel was factually well-grounded and highly principled. And so, we reported not just on Israeli abuses, but as we do in any conflict situation, on opposing abuses by Hamas, by the Palestinian Authority, by Hezbollah. So we would demonstrate our neutrality, by reporting on everybody. We would apply the same standards, the Geneva Conventions and the protocols, as we apply every place else. And we would ensure that everything we said was incredibly well researched and grounded in impeccable facts. And when you do this, they can kick and scream, but it doesn't change anything. And we found this, I think where they kicked and screamed the most was when we issued the report that you just alluded to, finding that the Israeli government was responsible for the crime against humanity of apartheid in the occupied territories. And what we meant by that was not a historical analogy to South Africa, but rather the application of international law as defined in the Convention Against Apartheid and the International Criminal Court founding treaty. And then you just, apply the facts to the law, and it becomes completely clear that this is apartheid. And, in the report, we anticipated all the predictable Israeli defenses. So they would say, oh, security. But, the security doesn't explain why they are, doing all this demographic engineering and trying to, depopulate areas that Israel wants to maintain. It doesn't explain why they don't let, a Palestinian who has a house in Area C of the occupied West Bank not build an extra bedroom. It doesn't explain why they don't allow, couples to marry and live within the West Bank if one of the members is, from outside. And what it totally doesn't explain are the settlements, which make Israelis less safe because they basically steal people's land, plop houses in the middle of it. I mean, this is an invitation for insecurity. So the security rationale has nothing to do with the apartheid. And the apartheid is really, the result of the Israeli government's preferred solution. They don't want equal rights within the one-state reality, which is one option. They don't want the two-state solution, which is, I think, the best option. The Israeli far right, is talking about mass deportation, which Trump has now endorsed, but that's, would be a blatant crime against humanity. So it's not a realistic option. And so what the Israeli government really wants is the status quo. Just keep kicking the can down the road and have an endless occupation, complaining always about a lack of partner in peace. And the point of the Human Rights Watch report, which was very much seconded by really every one of our human rights partners who looked at this seriously, is that this is apartheid, that the status quo is unsustainable. And what we hope to accomplish by this is to promote recognition that the only real viable solution is a two-state solution.
Israel, so the government, like you say, it kind of responds any kind of criticism or any sort of report of human rights abuses. The Israeli government responds with this kind of defensive mechanism. And one of the talking points for the Israeli government over many years is the UN has an anti-Israel bias. The Human Rights Council is anti-Israel. Is there any validity to that at all? Is this a similar sort of tactic to responding to Human Rights Watch? The kinds of reports that an organization like Human Rights Watch would publish, for example? Is it part of the same playbook, basically?
Yeah. Well, if you look at the UN Human Rights Council, it does focus a lot on Israel. And partly that's because the US vetoes any effort to bring up Israel at the UN Security Council. And if you look at the Human Rights Council, Israel objects to two things. One is that there's a special agenda item for the occupied territories, and there's no other situation that has its own agenda item. And second, they object to the number of resolutions. And our answer to that was, okay, fair enough. Let's have one single combined resolution and introduce it under a standard agenda item. We're fine with that. But of course, Israel wasn't fine with that, and the US government wasn't fine with that. And so it showed really the pretext. They say the council is biased, but again, what they really want is nothing at all. No criticism of Israel. And this is the same thing behind the charges of anti-Semitism. And you brought that up a moment ago, and I think I should answer it because I've been accused of being anti-Semitic, even though I'm Jewish. It's this is like the standard thing. When Karim Khan issued the war crimes charges against Netanyahu came out and said, this guy's the biggest anti-Semite in the world. This is just part of the Israeli government's talking points. And what bothers me about it is that it cheapens the very important concept of anti-Semitism at a point when Jews around the world need a strong defense against anti-Semitism, because it's a real threat. And what Netanyahu and his ilk have done is essentially turn this into what transparently is just another excuse to avoid criticism of Israel. And if that's what people think is going on whenever somebody raises the banner of anti-Semitism, they're going to ignore the problem of anti-Semitism because it's just an excuse not to criticize Israel when everybody recognizes that it deserves to be criticized for what it does in Gaza and what it does in the West Bank. And so, Netanyahu, in a sense, has made this calculation that it's more important to defend his right-wing government's serious abuses, his atrocities, arguably genocide in Gaza, over protecting Jews around the world. And this is, part of his political strategy abroad, where, the US government is obviously his most important partner. He's given up on American Jews because they tend to be liberal, they tend to vote Democratic, they tend to believe in rights. And instead, he's banking on AIPAC, which is, this right-wing, relatively small element of conservative American Jews, but mainly Christian evangelicals who support Israel not out of any love of Jews, but because they view Israel as a prerequisite to the second coming of Christ, at which point, any Jews who haven't converted will go to hell.
It's a short-term strategy.
Yes, so it's, Netanyahu kind of could care less about that, but he basically is, selling Jews around the world down the river in order to protect his right-wing government in Israel. And that is a real affront to the important concept of antisemitism that needs to be elevated because Jews around the world need it and need its defense.
And as you write in the book, I mean, not to kind of, we'll move on to another issue in a minute, but you have in your own history, close family history, family that fled Europe, during World War II. It's something that's obviously like very, very close to who you are, and yet you've spent years being kind of accused of being anti-Semitic.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's why I just don't take the charge seriously. But I mean, as I explained in the book, my father fled Nazi Germany in July 1938 and went to New York as a 12-year-old boy. And so I grew up with Hitler stories. I grew up completely aware of the evil that governments can do. And that's a big part of why I chose this career. I wanted to try to make these kind of atrocities harder to commit. But the lesson I draw from the Holocaust is not that you protect the Israeli government, whatever it does, not that you create a Palestine exception to human rights standards, because if there's a Palestinian exception today, there'll be an exception for Jews tomorrow. The only way to really protect Jews is to protect everybody, to have human rights standards that don't admit exceptions. And that's been, what I've tried to do with my professional career.
Moving on to the ICC, which you mentioned a minute ago, in the context of Israel, obviously it's, as an institution, it's been very prominent in recent months and years, not only because of Israel, but that story has, of course, contributed in large part to international focus on the ICC. The high-profile arrest warrants have been issued and so forth. Do you think, or to what extent do you think international law actually has teeth now and can make a difference? And what role do you see the ICC having in future?
I do think international law matters a lot. And I say that because it still provides guidance for how war should be conducted. And in the case of the ICC, we're mainly talking about war. And there once was a conception of war, that today is referred to as total war, where you do anything you want. You shoot all the civilians on the other side, you bomb the cities indiscriminately, you just make life as painful as possible until the other side, submits. And that's kind of how World War II was fought. The emergence of the Geneva Conventions, which were adopted in 1949, repudiated that approach and began the process of introducing standards that are designed to minimize harm to civilians. Never get rid of them, but still try to, make it possible as much as possible to save civilians the hazards of war. And those are standards that now every government subscribes to. These are not, standards that Human Rights Watch concocted. The militaries of the world adopted these standards. And what Human Rights Watch tries to do is defend those standards. And, I get into the book how at times we do try to nudge the standards in a more protective direction. That was, for example, what the landmines campaign was about. But, the day-to-day stuff, for example, if you look at, what Israel did in Gaza, they breached the basic rules against starving civilians on the other side. They breached the rules against indiscriminately bombing civilian neighborhoods. They breached the rule against, attacking even a military target if the harm to civilians would be disproportionate. And the only way to defend those standards is to document what happened and to push back. And the International Criminal Court, I think, plays an essential role there because nobody wants to be criminally charged. I mean, look at Netanyahu's response to this, So even though I have to admit that, as I say in the book, I'm disappointed by how little the ICC has done, in that, in its 20 plus years of existence, it really has only convicted warlords. It has not managed to convict government officials yet, but it is now charging important government officials. Putin was charged for kidnapping children in Ukraine. Netanyahu was charged for the starvation strategy in Gaza. The leader of the Myanmar military junta was charged for atrocities against Rohingya. So these are very important statements, and hopefully will lead to justice, to criminal convictions. But in the meantime, at least make clear that there are lines that cannot be transgressed.
What do you think is the greatest threat to the human rights system today? You talk in the book about this kind of, we're in a world where there are autocrats surrounded by sycophants, and kind of democracy is sort of under threat. Is this the biggest threat, or is it something else?
Well, I think, there really are two different kinds of threats, and maybe we should just talk about that. I mean, in the book, I describe China as the greatest threat. And I say that because, on the one hand, China, is incredibly repressive. It is also willing to use enormous resources from the world's second largest economy to try to quash any criticism of its repression. But it goes a step further. I mean, China is alone in trying to rewrite human rights standards. Other people will deny that they committed a human rights violation. They'll try to fend off criticism. But China is really trying to rewrite the standards. And what they have in mind is, obviously they don't want their civil and political rights assessed because, there are no elections, there's no free press, there's no civil society. So, that's not surprising. But they also don't want their economic and social rights practices assessed, because what that would require was looking at whether they are allocating available resources in a way that progressively realizes the rights of the worst off segments of society. But that would invite awkward questions about the fate of the Uyghurs or the fate of the Tibetans, or for that matter, the fate of Han Chinese in rural areas who are completely left behind. And so rather, Xi Jinping wants to say that all human rights require is a growth in GDP per capita, stability, and happiness, whatever that means. Those are his three criteria. And that's not what human rights are about. Those are much too gross standards. That just kind of takes the individual out of the picture. And so I think that, that is a very fundamental threat to human rights, because it just, rips up the treaties and starts over again. Now, separately from that, there is this, threat of autocracy. But that is, I think, a little bit different than usually appreciated. And I describe this in the book. But it's not as if the autocrats these days look so good, because if you think about it, they're not delivering. When you surround yourself with sycophants, you get Putin's disastrous decision to invade Ukraine. You get, Xi Jinping's, zero COVID fixation, which just, shut down China for a couple of years without any prospect of really, emerging from COVID. No preparation for what happened when zero COVID was abruptly lifted. You get him still, stifling the economy by attacking the parts that are independent from Communist Party control, whether it's the tech sector or even just consumers, making personal decisions rather than the state making decisions about how money is spent. So, the autocrats, even, with the two most prominent examples, are not looking so good. When people around the world who live in autocracies are given the choice, they take to the streets for democracy. And we've seen this in Hong Kong, in Thailand, in Iran, in Belarus, in Russia, in Uganda, in Nicaragua. You can just go on and on. They don't always prevail, but they make absolutely clear what people want. But I think today, in many ways, the biggest threat is within established democracies. And it's because there's a group of people who feel left behind, who feel not served by existing institutions, by the establishment. And Western democracies are struggling to reach these people. These are the people who are ripe for the appeal of the far right. These are Trump's people. These are the people of the AfD in Germany, or Marine Le Pen in France. And I think the big challenge here is to answer these autocrats within democracies. They try to change the subject. They try to demonize some enemy. And it could be immigrants, it could be gays, it could be, women's rights. They have their, usual panoply of enemies, and they try to blame everything on that. Now, obviously, that's not true. This is a kind of a diversion. It's not like Trump has an answer. He's imposing tariffs, which are making inflation worse. He's denying that climate change even exists. This is not a guy who's delivering, but he's very good at changing the subject, at appealing to people's worst emotions. And I think that the challenge for the human rights movement today is one, obviously pointing out that these are just diversions. These are not positive political programs. But also, we need to do a better job of building a broader sense of community. The autocrats have a sense of community, which is that, all these people I just named are outside. We don't have to worry about their rights. Indeed, they are threats to the community. And the progressive part of society has not been good at answering that because they've been so focused on what you might call identity politics. And they are not spending time building up a sense of national community where everybody in that community deserves rights. And so I think that there is some basic work that progressives have to do to create the foundation in which we are going to have more success, demanding that the rights of everybody be respected.
It seems that one of the big challenges we have in democracies related to that is the way we share information, what information people have access to, and do we have a kind of a shared conception of the world that we live in? And technology is obviously key to that. In the book, you talk about how communication technology was really important in building up the human rights movement and getting information, details to travel around that would allow you to build up the cases that you need. When you look at the future of communication technology and maybe how AI fits into that as well, do you think that will help or hinder with human rights work and that kind of task that you talked about there of building a sense of a national community and a group that's all in it together?
Well, as I describe in the book, I do view the history of the human rights movement as very much tracing the history of communication technology. In the early days of the movement, when information moved by sailing ship, all we could take on was very big, long-lasting problems like slavery or women's suffrage, but you couldn't take on, the massacre that took place yesterday. But, with the emergence of first the fax machine, then email, and today's social media, things move much faster. And so we are able to address, something happens today, we can try to prevent it from happening tomorrow. And that's, a great power. We also have the ability to organize. The campaign against anti-personnel landmines was made possible with the emergence of email. It had just happened, and it was the first time that we could cheaply and easily communicate with colleagues around the world. That would not have been possible 5 years earlier. And so, there is an organizing potential there, which can be exploited. Social media, I think, has made it virtually impossible for governments to hide things. Because today, everybody has a smartphone. Everybody takes photos or videos of interesting things that happen around them and posts them on social media. And you can scrape that information and get all this evidence. You still have to verify it and corroborate it. But, the idea that, the Khmer Rouge could commit these atrocities in Cambodia and we never knew for sure what was happening, that wouldn't happen today.
Mm.
So there is power in social media. But of course, it is also, it can be used to spread disinformation. It can be used to spread divisiveness. And that is, a challenge that we face. And AI is just going to make it worse because it allows, more bots to enter the conversation, if that's what you want to call it. I do still feel that the antidote to this is very careful investigation and reporting. And I say this in part just like, how do I consume information? I, look for institutions that I can trust. And, I know that if some piece of garbage shows up on my social media feed, I ignore it unless it's coming from, a person or an institution that I trust. And I think many people are like that. So, of course, some people will just believe whatever shows up. But I think that there are many intelligent consumers, and we need to produce more of them, that look at the source. And that, I think, is is the antidote to all of this. But I have to say that, I am not one of these people who, for example, is abandoning, X, what used to be Twitter, because Elon Musk took over. I mean, there are all these people who are moving to Blue Sky, and, I opened up a Blue Sky account and I post on it periodically, but it's so much not where the conversation is. I want to stay on X because I don't want to just speak to the choir. I want to speak where the conversation is taking place, even if it's a hostile conversation. And that's the same reason why, I've appeared on Fox News. I've appeared on RT. I think it's important to speak to hostile audiences because, otherwise you're just speaking to yourselves and you don't get things done that way.
Mm-hmm.
It's worth making clear for listeners who don't follow you on X that you have something like, you have nearly 1 million followers on there or something. You have a
Not
huge
quite.
platform on X.
It's 600,000.
600,000, but you've really used that for many years as a way of kind of finding information and kind of advocating for human rights. So it's been a really major platform for you. So just in case anyone was wondering what the power of that platform is, who's listening, but we're nearly out of time, Ken. But something we'd like to ask people on this podcast, I'll ask you before we finish, because we're talking often about questions that are dark and overwhelming and difficult, is around hope or optimism, where you find it. So I want to ask you how hopeful you are about the future of human rights and why, but also what listeners to this podcast can sort of do to participate in defending human rights.
Well, I mean, I'm not sort of naively hopeful where I think like everything's going to turn out for the best, but rather I'm very aware of the capacity of the human rights movement to move even powerful governments. And I mean, I describe in the book how it's not a linear process. This idea that, the arc of history bends toward justice. It's not like that. It's a battle, but it's worth engaging in the battle because sometimes we win, sometimes we just stall bad things from happening. But if you abandon the battle, you cede the field to the autocrats and the tyrants, and the world would be a much worse place. And so, I mean, I stay energized because I see how we can make a difference. And what I hope to accomplish with the book is to show people why concretely they should feel the same way. That if they, understand all these things that have been done, that can be done, that even today should be done, it's an argument for staying engaged. And, obviously people can, support a human rights organization, but at a much more personal level, and this is coming back to the social media conversation, today people tend to trust those who are closest to them. So, they may read a newspaper with a degree of skepticism. They certainly don't believe what governments say, but they're more inclined to think, oh, well, my friend said this or my relative said this, that's worth listening to. And social media gives all of us the capacity to promote facts and views that within our community will be heard. And we have to recognize the importance of that because, upholding human rights is not something you just leave to human rights groups. Upholding human rights is something that all of us have a responsibility to do, our part to promote. And there are things that all of us can do. So that's one of the things I hope people take from the book.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Ken, for joining us.
Thank
you very much for having me.
This interview was from an episode of the Prospect podcast. To listen to the episode in full, including further discussion and our weekly banger and dud section, click the link in the description below. And to read more of Prospect's award-winning journalism, head to prospectmagazine.co.uk.